Hey guys, I just finished building my new drill organizer rack. Now it's actually a fairly simple design that I managed to make a little more complicated than maybe it needed to be. It's just a flat top with a little bit of a lip up there so that any of your stuff that you have up there doesn't just roll off on you. The storage little cubbies are deep enough that you can leave bits inside your drills and your drivers so that you can get to it really fast. So if you wanted to, you could have a Phillips and a Torx and a flathead for Drew. But if you don't want that particular bit, you can just throw it up there on the magnetic strip built into the face of it so that it's easy to get to later. Anyway, that's it for the features. Let's get to the build. I started out with a piece of rough cut walnut and very roughly drew out my pieces in chalk so I could break down the board into more manageable pieces before flattening and squaring them. I could have done the jointing and planing with the board as one full piece, but that would end up wasting more material and potentially sacrificing the overall thickness of the board. Over an 8-foot board, there's so much more room for bowing, twisting, and general warping that results in lots of peaks and valleys. By breaking the board into shorter pieces first, those imperfections fight with each other over a much smaller area, resulting in reduced material loss. With the boards ready to go, I started by working on the front manifold piece since that was going to be the most complicated. I cut it to exact length and width, then marked out all the different cuts and joinery it would receive. First up was a deep pocket for the magnets, which would get cut out on the router table. I drilled an oversized hole stopping just short of passing through the material. Then, that hole can slip down over the router bit with plenty of wiggle room around it. This allowed me to start the router with the workpiece in place. Then I slowly pushed the board across the router table, starting and stopping at the lines I'd marked on the fence to give me the desired length. I set up my dado stack with a sacrificial fence on the table saw to start cutting the joinery. And at this point, I started to get a little indecisive about my order of operations. See, if I cut all the joinery, which is just rabbets around the perimeter of the board, I would lose the outside edges of the circles I drew. Well, fair enough, I could just start those cuts now while I still have the pencil marks to follow, then finish them later. Well, wait a minute. I would still have to finesse the cut up to the line later with the spindle sander, so we're back to the beginning. Okay, I can just cut and sand the circles out perfectly before cutting the rabbets. Well, that made me nervous about breaking the little tabs off since there would be so little material left to support it. See? Have you ever had one of those problems where the solution feels like it should be obvious, but your brain is just putting up roadblocks for some reason? Well, in this case, all I had to do was draw the blasted circles on the other side of the board. Dummy. Moving on. Rabbets cut, circles cut and sanded. The complicated manifold piece was finally finished after lots of tools set up, bouncing back and forth between tools, and more muttering curse words to myself than I'd like to admit. Cutting out the manifold using more traditional tools was obviously possible, but it turns out there was a much easier way. I already had the drawing in the computer from designing this project, so I just imported it into Easel and hit carve. It took me just under 2 hours to cut out the manifold with saws and a sander, and I ended up with more imperfections than I would have liked. With the x-carve, it took 59 minutes, had 0 flaws, and allowed me to work on other things while it did the work. Since I already had the machine set up, I decided to let the x-carve cut the rest of the pieces out for me as well. These would obviously be really simple to cut out with traditional equipment, but at this point, I wanted to see how good the joinery would fit together coming off of the CNC machine. As a side note, you might want to call me out on this piece because the grain direction won't match up all the way around the finished project. But that was a calculated decision. I didn't quite have enough material in the original walnut board, so I made sure the piece that doesn't quite match will be the one that faces into a corner where it will never be seen once it's hung on the wall. I test fit the pieces together and everything looked good. You'll notice I used plywood for the top, mostly because that part will never be seen anyway, unless a really, really tall person ever visits my shop. Bruce. Now for the second most complicated piece, I traced where the curves of the manifold meet the bottom. There's no good reason why I made this part so complicated. You could just cut 45s or you could cut 90s, but I just had it in my head that I wanted the curve of the front-facing circle to continue through the project. Now if you have an x-carve, you could use one of the apps built into Easel to try to achieve this same curve, but I decided to try a different method, mostly because I just didn't have the right kind of bits on hand. Using a hole saw the same diameter as the holes in my manifold, yes, I could have used this instead of the bandsaw earlier as well, I set up my drill press and clamped the workpiece to the fence. Very carefully, I would plunge down the depth of the hole saw, then take the piece to my bench and knock out the waste with a chisel before repeating the process as many times as it took to reach my stop mark. With each cut, the remaining fingers in the board were getting more delicate, so I would clamp scraps of wood to both sides to prevent anything from snapping off. It took a little cleanup on the back end with a bandsaw and a chisel to square off the inside cuts. There's no doubt that this process was really tedious, but I sure liked the end result. The biggest drill I have in my arsenal is this big 20-volt hammer drill, and it's much longer than anything else that I have. So I had to play this sort of compromise between fitting this one versus fitting my smaller ones and not wanting it to look too big. So I didn't want this to dictate what the whole project was like, but I had to weigh it back and forth. And one last step before we actually put this together is you can see how when the big drill is sitting in here, it's kind of front heavy. And that's because it's longer than these channels that I've cut out. Now, all I'm gonna do is take and hand carve out a little bit of a dish in this shape here so that this can sit a little bit more flush and get a little bit further back into the organizer. I traced out the rough shape that this recess needed to be, then I set to work carving on it. This is actually my first time ever trying some hand carving, and with a brand new extra sharp tool, it was actually quite enjoyable. All right, guys, now is where this design starts to get a little bit more interesting. Up until this point, it's all been cosmetic. It's been trying to make this organizer look nice, but this gives it a feature that I think is really cool. This channel cut into the back of here is where I'm gonna put a bunch of magnets. If you've seen my magnetic knife holder video in the past, you've seen this exact thing before, but I learned something after completing that video that I'm gonna incorporate here that's kind of important, and let me explain that to you. If you're not following just yet, the material inside this groove that's remaining is about as thick as this board. Well, I can take a big powerful magnet and start dropping my driver bits on there, and so now I'm going to be able to embed magnets into the manifold piece and then have all these bits just hang out up here, easy to grab when you grab your drill. Now, let's show you a little bit of an experiment. So to fill up this channel, I have several of these magnets that'll friction fit down in there, and I'll probably epoxy them in just to make sure they stay really well. But I'll have to stack a bunch of them end to end to make them fit. Now if you look at this, you've got a red mark on one side and not on the other. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. These things repel each other when you have those marks facing the same way. It's the positive-negative idea. See? But you flip it over and they grab each other really well. What's important here is that, okay, this makes it really easy to shove it in there if you just alternate it back and forth, but that's not exactly a good thing because if I put a long one of these on here, it wants to spin. Because of the poles pulling it in different directions, and I'm not going to pretend I know the science behind this, I just know what the problem is and what the solution is going to be. Because those poles are pulling in different directions, any one of these bits that's not perfectly squared off is going to spin and flip like that. Even a littler one is going to do it. Well, that's not doing it so bad. Yeah, eventually it'll grab like that. Its tendency is to want to pivot and not stand straight up and down. Not that I care if it's straight up and down, but I want to be able to put it on here however I want. So like a long one, if you can imagine a long one on this, that gets in the way of things. So I need to be able to sort of position that however I want to. So if you do let the magnets do what they want to do, it's going to pull it sideways. If I take and actually clamp these down, they don't want to go together, but I can force them to be together. See how it's still fighting me? I can force it together, clamp it down, and now imagine this is just the way it's pushed into that channel here in the manifold piece. If I just put that there, now it doesn't want to spin. It stays wherever I put it, within reason. See, it's not spinning, it's not twirling, it's not fighting me. So what I'm getting at is I'm going to try to force these magnets into this channel with the opposing poles facing each other to try to prevent that pivoting thing from happening. And when I mentioned my knife block earlier, you can actually go into my kitchen right now and see them. None of the knives will sit straight up and down. Every one of them goes boink until it kind of catches on one of the corners of the next magnet embedded in the back of the wood. So I think this way I can keep all of my bits pointed straight up and down instead of pivoting like those knives have. I took a minute to square up the rounded corners left by the router bit, then mixed up a bit of epoxy and poured it in the groove. Once this is assembled, there's no way for the magnets to come out, but I wanted to make sure they couldn't jump out before then, hence the epoxy. The first couple of magnets were easy enough to push down into the groove, then hold the previous one down with a stick while I slid the next one in. By the end, they started to give me a little bit more trouble and causing a mess, so I put on some gloves, which I should have had from the start. Eventually, I got them all in and started wiping up my mess.
Oh, come on!
My super smart brain finally figured out that this would be a lot easier if I used a big piece of iron under the wood to attract the magnets and hold them in place while the epoxy set up. I pre-finished all the parts that would face the inside of the box, then finally got to put this thing together.
Note to self: next time, design a shape that is easier to get clamps on.
There was some finish sanding necessary to make sure all the joints lined up nicely. Then I added a small chamfer to the inside of the holes to help guide the drills in a little easier. I brushed on some finish, and after drying, I drilled mounting holes through the back. I screwed one side to the wall, then checked for level before securing it. You could use keyholes in the back if you wanted, but this just felt a little easier. I'm really excited about how this thing turned out. Now, I didn't want to build in a bunch of storage for things like drill bits because those typically live over there by my drill press. I didn't want to put in storage for batteries because most of my cordless tools have one battery in them all of the time, and when that battery's dead, I charge it. So with these right here next to a charger that I mounted, it's really easy to keep them up and running. Now, I want to say a huge thank you to Inventables for supporting this video. I did not plan on using an x-carve to build it in the first place. I planned on traditional joinery using dados from either the table saw or a router table, but as it turns out, that was the right tool for the job. So thank you to Inventables. You guys should definitely go check them out. They have great products to help you get into the whole CNC world. If you don't have a CNC and you'd like to build one of these, I've got plans available. You can go down into the description and find a link to the plans. Those will walk you through how to build this using the table saw or the router table, whatever you have available to you. Gosh, I really think that's about it. Thrilled with this. I'll let you know what I think about it in the future, but I think it looks classy. It's very small and convenient, and I'm rambling now like I always do. If I forgot anything, I'll probably write it in the description, so check that out. If you think I earned it, maybe give me a like and a subscribe. That helps out the channel. And boy, I really think that's about it. So thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.